Captain Elena Vasquez pressed her binoculars against the cracked concrete of the observation tower, scanning the desolate landscape that stretched beyond the razor wire fence. The morning mist clung to the abandoned suburbs like a shroud, and somewhere in that gray expanse, movement caught her eye. 3 years had passed since the great silence fell over the eastern territories, and the border between the living and the dead had held firm. Until now. The fence stood 30 feet high, topped with electrified coils that hummed with deadly current, but Elena knew that steel and voltage meant nothing if the horde had truly awakened. Behind her, Sergeant Martinez cleaned his rifle for the 3rd time that morning, his nervous energy infectious among the small garrison stationed at Checkpoint Alpha 7. They were the forgotten soldiers, posted at the edge of civilization where the maps simply ended and the words, "Dead Zone," were printed in stark red letters. The radio crackled to life, breaking the oppressive quiet that had become their constant companion. "Alpha 7, this is command. Report status." Elena lifted the handset, her voice steady despite the unease gnawing at her stomach. "Command, this is Alpha 7. All quiet on the Eastern Front. No movement detected in the past 48 hours. But even as she spoke, she watched a flock of ravens explode from the skeletal remains of a shopping mall, their cries piercing the morning air like warning bells. Something had disturbed them, something big enough to send the scavengers fleeing. The dead zone had earned its name through 3 years of absolute silence, no radio transmissions, no signs of life, not even the desperate SOS signals that had flooded the airwaves during the initial outbreak. The government had written off everything east of the Mississippi as a total loss, focusing their resources on fortifying the western territories where survivors still clung to the remnants of civilization. Elena's team of 12 soldiers represented the thin line between hope and despair, between the world that was and the nightmare that waited beyond the fence. They had volunteered for this posting, each carrying their own reasons for choosing the isolation of the border over the relative safety of the inner settlements. Some came seeking redemption for past failures, others driven by the need to protect what remained of their families, and a few simply because they had nowhere else to go. The checkpoint itself was a monument to human ingenuity and desperation, built from salvaged materials and reinforced with every piece of military hardware they could scavenge. Solar panels powered their equipment, rainwater collectors kept them hydrated, and a small greenhouse provided fresh vegetables to supplement their rations. They had created a pocket of life in the shadow of death, a testament to humanity's refusal to surrender. The morning routine continued as it had for months, with guards rotating their positions and technical specialists maintaining the early warning systems that monitored the dead zone. Motion sensors, thermal cameras, and seismic detectors created an invisible net that should have alerted them to any significant movement, but the equipment had its limitations. The electromagnetic interference from the eastern territories had grown stronger over the past weeks, causing equipment failures and strange readings that made accurate monitoring nearly impossible. Elena had filed reports about the anomalies, but command seemed more interested in maintaining the illusion of control than investigating potential threats. The politicians and generals in their comfortable bunkers preferred to believe that the dead zone was contained, that the horrors beyond the fence would remain dormant forever. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist, Elena noticed something that made her blood run cold. The silence was too complete, too absolute. Even in the dead zone, there should have been some ambient noise, the sound of wind through broken windows, the rustle of debris, the distant calls of wild animals that had reclaimed the abandoned cities. But today there was nothing, as if the entire eastern seaboard was holding its breath. She adjusted her binoculars, focusing on the nearest cluster of buildings, and that's when she saw them. Shadows moving with purpose between the ruins, too coordinated to be animals, too numerous to be survivors. The shambling gait was unmistakable, and Elena felt her heart skip a beat as she realized that the 3-year silence was about to end. The dead were moving again, and they were moving west toward the living, toward the fence that had protected the remnants of America for so long. She reached for her radio, knowing that the message she was about to send would change everything for the soldiers under her command and the millions of survivors who believed they were safe behind their walls and weapons. The alarm pierced through Checkpoint Alpha 7 with a mechanical shriek that sent every soldier scrambling for their weapons. Elena's voice crackled over the intercom system, her words cutting through the chaos like a blade through silk. All units to defensive positions. We have multiple contacts approaching from the northeast sector. This is not a drill. The command bunker erupted into controlled pandemonium as Sergeant Martinez coordinated the response, his years of military experience kicking in despite the unprecedented nature of the threat. The soldiers had trained for this moment, running countless drills and scenarios, But nothing had prepared them for the reality of facing an enemy that had spent 3 years learning, adapting, and planning in the shadows of the dead zone. Elena remained at her observation post, her binoculars tracking the approaching horde with growing disbelief. The zombies moved with purpose, their shambling gait replaced by something that resembled tactical advance. They approached in waves, with what appeared to be scouts probing the perimeter while the main force maintained formation behind cover. It defied everything the military had taught them about the infected, everything the scientists had theorized about their limited cognitive capabilities. These creatures weren't driven by mindless hunger alone. They were executing a coordinated assault with the precision of trained soldiers. The electromagnetic interference suddenly made sense. It wasn't a random phenomenon but a deliberate jamming operation designed to blind the border defenses to the approaching threat. The radio exploded with reports from other checkpoints along the border. Alpha 3 reported massive movement in their sector, Bravo 1 was requesting immediate reinforcements, and Charlie 7 had gone silent entirely. The scope of the coordinated attack became clear as Elena listened to the desperate transmissions flooding the emergency frequencies. This wasn't a random migration or a localized outbreak. It was a full-scale invasion planned and executed with military precision. The dead had spent 3 years in apparent dormancy, but they had been using that time to organize, to learn, and to prepare for this moment when they would reclaim the territory they had lost. Elena's team took their positions along the fortified walls, their weapons trained on the approaching horde. Corporal Johnson manned the mounted machine gun, his hands steady despite the sweat beading on his forehead. Private Williams checked and rechecked his ammunition supplies, while Medic Torres prepared the medical station for casualties they all knew were coming. The soldiers had become a family during their months of isolation, bonded by shared hardship and the constant threat of death. They had volunteered for this posting knowing the risks, but facing the reality of imminent combat brought a clarity that no amount of training could provide. The first wave of zombies reached the outer perimeter, and Elena watched in horror as they began to systematically probe the defenses. Some carried makeshift shields fashioned from car doors and street signs, while others wielded crude weapons that showed clear signs of modification and improvement. They moved with purpose, testing the electrified fence at multiple points while maintaining cover behind abandoned vehicles and debris. The random shambling of the early outbreak had been replaced by tactical awareness that suggested intelligence far beyond what anyone had imagined possible. Elena coordinated the defense through her radio, directing fire and managing ammunition distribution while trying to maintain contact with command. The reports coming in from other sectors painted a grim picture of a coordinated assault that stretched across hundreds of miles of border. The zombies weren't just attacking randomly, they were executing a strategic operation designed to overwhelm the defenses at multiple points simultaneously. The 3-year silence hadn't been dormancy, it had been preparation, and now the fruits of that preparation were becoming terrifyingly clear. As the battle intensified, Elena noticed something that made her blood run cold. The zombies were learning from their encounters with the defenses, adapting their tactics in real time based on the soldiers' responses. When Johnson's machine gun fire proved effective, they began using smoke and debris to obscure his line of sight. When the electric fence deterred direct assault, they started using metal poles and chains to create safe pathways through the barrier. The enemy they faced wasn't just organized, it was intelligent, capable of problem-solving and tactical adaptation that rivaled human military units. The communication equipment began to fail as the electromagnetic interference intensified, cutting off contact with command and leaving the checkpoint isolated. Elena realized that they were facing not just a physical assault but a comprehensive attack designed to neutralize their ability to coordinate and call for support. The zombies had planned this operation down to the smallest detail, and the soldiers at Checkpoint Alpha 7 were about to discover just how far the infected had evolved during their years of apparent silence. The war for the living had begun, and humanity's defenders were learning that their enemy was far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The electrified fence that had protected the border for 3 years began to fail in sections as the zombies executed their assault with devastating precision. Elena watched in disbelief as the infected used salvaged metal sheets and their own bodies to create pathways through the barrier, their coordination resembling a military engineering unit more than a mindless horde. The creatures in the front ranks threw themselves against the electrified wire, absorbing the deadly current while others quickly piled debris and metal scraps to create bridges over their fallen comrades. The sacrifice was calculated, methodical, and terrifyingly effective as gaps began to appear in what had been considered an impenetrable defense. Sergeant Martinez coordinated the defensive fire, his voice steady over the radio despite the chaos erupting around them. Concentrate fire on the breach points. Don't let them establish a foothold. The soldiers responded with disciplined volleys, their training taking over as muscle memory guided their actions. Corporal Johnson's machine gun chattered continuously, cutting down zombies as they attempted to climb through the gaps, but for every one that fell, 2 more took its place. The infected showed no fear of death, no hesitation in the face of overwhelming firepower, and their relentless advance began to overwhelm the checkpoint's defensive capabilities. Elena realized with growing horror that the zombies were using tools and weapons with disturbing proficiency. Some carried makeshift spears fashioned from rebar and broken glass, while others wielded crowbars and hammers with the skill of experienced fighters. They moved in coordinated groups, with some providing cover while others advanced, displaying tactical awareness that challenged everything the military had believed about the infected. The creatures that had once been mindless flesh-eating monsters had evolved into something far more dangerous, an organized army capable of strategy and adaptation. The breach in the fence widened as more zombies poured through, their numbers seemingly endless. Elena made the tactical decision to fall back to the secondary defensive line, ordering her team to abandon the outer perimeter before they were completely overrun. The soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, covering each other's retreat while maintaining suppressive fire on the advancing horde. Private Williams provided covering fire from the communications tower while Medic Torres helped wounded soldiers reach safety, their movements coordinated despite the chaos surrounding them. As they retreated, Elena caught glimpses of the true scope of the zombie organization. The infected had established what appeared to be a command structure, with certain individuals directing the movements of larger groups through gestures and vocalizations that resembled primitive communication. These leader zombies showed signs of advanced decay that suggested they had been among the first infected, their extended survival indicating an evolutionary advantage that had allowed them to develop beyond their original state. The implications were staggering. The zombies weren't just organized, they were developing a social hierarchy and communication system. The secondary defensive line consisted of reinforced bunkers and interlocking fields of fire that should have provided better protection, but Elena knew it was only a matter of time before the zombies adapted to this new obstacle. The infected had already demonstrated their ability to learn and overcome defensive measures, and the checkpoint's limited ammunition supply wouldn't last indefinitely against such overwhelming numbers. The radio crackled with desperate reports from other positions along the border, painting a picture of coordinated failure as the zombie assault succeeded beyond their worst nightmares. Elena's team fought desperately to hold their position, but the zombies continued to adapt their tactics with each passing minute. They began using smoke from burning debris to obscure the soldiers' vision, while others created diversions that drew fire away from the main assault groups. The infected showed patience and cunning that defied every assumption about their capabilities, waiting for the right moment to strike while conserving their numbers for maximum impact. The battle became a deadly game of chess, with the zombies proving to be far more capable opponents than anyone had imagined. As ammunition ran low and casualties mounted, Elena faced the most difficult decision of her military career. The checkpoint was lost, the border had been breached, and continuing to fight would only result in the death of her remaining soldiers without achieving any strategic advantage. The infected had won this battle through superior numbers, organization, and tactical flexibility, but the war was far from over. Elena made the call that would haunt her for the rest of her life, ordering the evacuation of Checkpoint Alpha 7 and the abandonment of the border that had protected the survivors for 3 years. The retreat began under heavy fire as the zombies pressed their advantage, pursuing the fleeing soldiers with coordinated efficiency. Elena stayed behind to provide covering fire, ensuring that her team had time to reach the evacuation vehicles before following them into the uncertain darkness beyond the checkpoint. The border between the living and the dead had been shattered, and the infected were now free to advance into the territories that had believed themselves safe. The nightmare that had been contained for 3 years was finally unleashed, and Elena knew that everything would change from this moment forward. Elena's convoy raced through the abandoned highways leading away from the collapsed border, their vehicles loaded with the surviving soldiers from Checkpoint Alpha 7 and whatever supplies they could salvage during the chaotic retreat. The headlights cut through the darkness as they navigated around abandoned cars and debris, each mile taking them further from the battle they had lost but closer to the civilian populations who remained unaware of the approaching threat. Behind them, the glow of fires marked the locations where other checkpoints had fallen, a chain of defeat that stretched across the entire eastern border as the zombie invasion spread like wildfire through the night. The radio crackled with desperate transmissions from other military units attempting to coordinate a response to the unprecedented assault. Elena tried to maintain contact with command, but the electromagnetic interference continued to disrupt communications, leaving isolated units to fight their own battles without support or coordination. The infected had clearly planned this aspect of their attack, using their mysterious ability to generate interference as a weapon to prevent effective resistance. The military's reliance on modern communication systems had become a critical vulnerability that the zombies exploited with devastating effectiveness. As dawn broke over the landscape, Elena's convoy encountered their first group of civilian refugees fleeing the Eastern Territories. The survivors told horrifying stories of coordinated attacks on settlements that had believed themselves safe behind their walls and weapons. The zombies had struck simultaneously across multiple locations, using tactics that suggested detailed reconnaissance and planning that must have taken months to coordinate. Among the refugees was Dr. Sarah Chen, a woman who claimed to have been conducting research within the dead zone before the outbreak of hostilities began. Dr. Chen's appearance raised immediate suspicions among Elena's soldiers, who questioned how anyone could have survived 3 years in zombie-controlled territory. The scientist explained that she had been part of a classified research project studying the infection's progression, working from a hidden laboratory that had remained undetected by the zombie forces. Her research had revealed disturbing evidence that the infection was continuing to evolve, developing new capabilities that went far beyond the original outbreak parameters. The zombies weren't just getting smarter, they were becoming something entirely different from the creatures that had first emerged 3 years ago. The convoy continued its journey toward the inner settlements, but Elena noticed signs that they were being followed. Zombie scouts appeared at regular intervals, maintaining visual contact with the fleeing humans while staying beyond weapons range. The infected were tracking their movements with military precision, coordinating their surveillance in ways that suggested real-time communication across vast distances. Dr. Chen confirmed Elena's worst fears, explaining that the zombies had developed a form of collective intelligence that allowed them to share information instantaneously across their entire population. The pursuit became more obvious as the day progressed, with larger groups of zombies appearing on parallel routes and elevated positions that provided clear views of the convoy's path. Elena realized that they weren't just being followed, they were being herded toward a specific destination where the zombies had prepared an ambush. The infected had learned to think strategically, using the humans' own escape routes against them while maintaining the illusion that retreat was still possible. The psychological warfare was as sophisticated as any human military operation, designed to instill fear and desperation in their prey. Elena made the difficult decision to abandon the main highway, leading the convoy onto secondary roads that wound through abandoned towns and industrial areas. The detour would slow their progress towards safety, but it might also disrupt the zombies' carefully laid plans and give the survivors a chance to escape the closing trap. Dr. Chen provided valuable intelligence about the infected's behavior patterns, helping Elena choose routes that would minimize their exposure to zombie patrols while maximizing their chances of reaching the inner settlements alive. The abandoned towns they passed through showed clear signs of zombie occupation, with barricades and defensive positions that suggested the infected had been preparing for this invasion for months. The creatures had turned the ruins of human civilization into forward operating bases, complete with supply caches and communication networks that supported their advancing forces. Elena began to understand that the 3-year silence hadn't been dormancy, it had been the largest military buildup in human history, conducted by an enemy that had learned to think and plan like humans while retaining the relentless determination of the infected. As night fell again, Elena's convoy found temporary shelter in an abandoned factory complex, but the soldiers knew that their pursuers were closing in. Dr. Chen revealed more details about her research, explaining that the zombie evolution was following a pattern that suggested artificial acceleration rather than natural development. The infection might not be entirely natural, but rather an engineered biological weapon that continued to evolve according to its original programming. The implications were staggering. If the zombies were still following embedded instructions, then their invasion might be just the beginning of a much larger and more terrifying plan that threatened not just the survivors, but the entire future of human civilization on Earth. The abandoned factory complex provided temporary shelter as Elena's convoy sought refuge from their relentless pursuers, but the brief respite only intensified the growing tension between the survivors. Dr. Sarah Chen's presence had become a source of heated debate among the soldiers, with some viewing her as a valuable asset while others questioned her motives and the circumstances of her survival. Elena found herself caught between her duty to protect the civilian survivors and her obligation to maintain the security of her remaining soldiers, a balance that became increasingly difficult as paranoia spread through the group like a contagion. Dr. Chen seemed oblivious to the suspicion surrounding her, instead focusing on her research data and the disturbing implications of what she had discovered during her time in the dead zone. She explained that the infection wasn't behaving like any natural pathogen they had encountered, evolving too rapidly and in directions that seemed purposeful rather than random. The zombies were developing capabilities that went beyond simple adaptation, showing signs of coordinated evolution that suggested external guidance or programming. The scientists' theories challenged everything the military and scientific communities believed about the outbreak, proposing that they were facing not just an infection but a sophisticated biological weapon. Elena listened to Dr. Chen's explanations with growing unease, recognizing the implications of what the scientist was suggesting. If the infection was indeed artificial, then someone or something had deliberately created a weapon designed to overthrow human civilization. The 3-year silence took on new meaning as a period of controlled development, with the zombies following predetermined instructions that guided their evolution towards specific goals. The coordinated nature of the current invasion wasn't just learned behavior, it was the activation of programmed responses that had been dormant since the original outbreak. The conversation was interrupted by Sergeant Martinez, who reported unusual activity in the surrounding area. Zombie scouts had been spotted at regular intervals around the factory complex, but they weren't attempting to breach the perimeter. Instead, they seemed to be maintaining surveillance while preventing the survivors from leaving, creating an invisible prison that trapped them within the abandoned facility. Dr. Chen's expression grew troubled as she realized the implications of the zombies' behavior, recognizing patterns that confirmed her worst fears about the infection's true nature. Elena demanded answers from Dr. Chen, pressing the scientist to reveal more about her research and the circumstances that had allowed her to survive in zombie territory. The woman finally admitted that she hadn't been conducting independent research but had been part of a classified government project called Operation Dead End, designed to study potential biological weapons and develop countermeasures. The project had been shut down after the outbreak began, but Dr. Chen had continued her work from a hidden facility, trying to understand what had gone wrong with the original containment protocols. The revelation sent shockwaves through the group as Elena realized they were dealing with a government cover-up that went to the highest levels of the military and political establishment. Dr. Chen explained that Operation Dead End had been based on recovered samples from an unknown source, possibly extraterrestrial in origin, that had been weaponized without fully understanding their potential consequences. The scientists had believed they could control the infection's spread and evolution, but they had underestimated the adaptability and intelligence of the pathogen they were attempting to harness. Elena's soldiers reacted with anger and betrayal, realizing that their government had potentially caused the apocalypse they were now fighting to survive. The border defenses they had died to protect were nothing more than a desperate attempt to contain a threat that the authorities had created through their own reckless experimentation. Dr. Chen tried to explain that the original researchers had believed they were developing defensive capabilities, but Elena could see the guilt and fear in the scientist's eyes as she revealed the full scope of the disaster. The debate over Dr. Chen's fate was interrupted by a new development that changed everything. The zombie scouts surrounding the factory began to withdraw, but not in retreat. They were being recalled by something that required their attention elsewhere. Dr. Chen's face went pale as she realized what was happening, explaining that the zombies were being summoned to participate in the next phase of their programmed evolution. The infection wasn't just spreading randomly, it was following a specific timeline that would lead to even more dangerous developments. Elena faced an impossible choice as she weighed the value of Dr. Chen's knowledge against the security risks of keeping her with the group. The scientist claimed to have developed a potential weapon against the zombie collective intelligence, but using it would require access to specialized equipment and materials that might not be available. The survivors were running out of time as the zombie forces regrouped for their next assault, and Elena knew that every decision she made could mean the difference between survival and extinction for the remaining human population. The revelation about the infection's artificial origins had changed everything, but it had also provided a glimmer of hope that the nightmare might still be reversible if they could find the courage to act. Elena's convoy reached the fortified settlement of Haven's Rest just as the first light of dawn revealed the scope of the zombie forces massing in the surrounding hills. The town had been built as a model of post-apocalyptic survival, with reinforced walls, watchtowers, and defensive positions that should have been able to withstand any conventional assault. The residents had prepared for attacks by scattered zombie groups or desperate human raiders, but nothing had prepared them for the coordinated army that now surrounded their community with military precision. Elena's arrival brought both reinforcements and the terrible knowledge that their sanctuary was about to become the site of humanity's most desperate battle. Mayor Patricia Hendricks welcomed Elena's soldiers with relief and growing alarm as the captain briefed her on the situation. The town's population of 300 souls included families with children, elderly residents, and civilians who had never seen combat outside of their nightmares. Dr. Chen's presence added another layer of complexity to the situation, as her knowledge of the zombie evolution could prove crucial to the town's survival, but her connection to the original outbreak made her a controversial figure among the residents who learned of her involvement in Operation Dead End. The zombie forces demonstrated their evolved intelligence by establishing a siege perimeter that cut off all escape routes while systematically targeting the town's infrastructure. They severed power lines, contaminated water supplies, and jammed radio communications with the same electromagnetic interference that had plagued the border defenses. The infected had learned to wage total war, using psychological pressure and resource denial to weaken their enemies before launching direct assaults. Elena realized that the 3-year silence had been used not just to evolve physically, but to study human defensive strategies and develop countermeasures for every tactic the survivors might employ. The first probing attacks came at dawn, with small groups of zombies testing the perimeter defenses while larger formations remained hidden in the surrounding terrain. Elena coordinated the defensive response from the town hall, using her military experience to organize the civilian volunteers into effective fighting units. The residents of Haven's Rest had trained for this moment, but their preparation had been based on outdated assumptions about zombie behavior and capabilities. Elena had to quickly adapt their tactics to account for an enemy that could learn, plan, and execute complex strategies. Dr. Chen worked frantically to analyze the zombie behavioral patterns, using her research to predict their next moves and identify potential weaknesses in their coordination. She explained that the collective intelligence binding the zombies together might have vulnerabilities that could be exploited, but accessing those weaknesses would require understanding the specific frequencies and patterns they used for communication. The scientist's equipment had been damaged during the retreat from the border, limiting her ability to conduct the research that might save the town. The siege intensified as the zombies began using captured vehicles and construction equipment to breach the outer defenses. They had learned to operate machinery with disturbing proficiency, turning the town's own abandoned equipment against its former owners. Elena watched in horror as infected driving bulldozers and excavators systematically dismantled the barriers that had protected Haven's Rest for years. The zombies weren't just adapting to human technology, they were mastering it, using tools and weapons with a skill that suggested they retained some of their original human knowledge and abilities. The civilian population began to crack under the pressure of the siege, with some residents demanding that Dr. Chen be turned over to the zombies in hopes of ending the assault. Elena found herself not only fighting an external enemy but also managing internal dissent that threatened to tear the community apart from within. Mayor Hendricks struggled to maintain order as panic spread through the population, and Elena realized that the zombies' psychological warfare was as effective as their physical attacks in weakening the defenders' resolve. As ammunition ran low and casualties mounted, Elena made the difficult decision to organize a fighting withdrawal toward the town's emergency evacuation routes. The original plan had been to hold the defensive positions indefinitely, but the zombies' superior numbers and tactical flexibility made that strategy untenable. The evacuation would require precise timing and coordination, as the survivors would have to break through zombie positions while protecting the civilian population from a pursuing enemy that showed no mercy to the weak or wounded. Dr. Chen revealed that she had been working on a potential weapon against the zombie collective intelligence, but deploying it would require someone to get close enough to the enemy command structure to deliver the device. The mission would be essentially suicidal, as it would require penetrating deep into zombie-controlled territory and facing the most evolved and dangerous infected specimens. Elena understood the implications of what Dr. Chen was proposing. Someone would have to sacrifice themselves to give the evacuating civilians a chance to escape, and the responsibility for that sacrifice would fall to the military personnel who had sworn to protect the innocent. The battle for Haven's Rest was about to become a test of human courage and determination against an enemy that had evolved beyond their worst nightmares, and Elena knew that the choices made in the next few hours would determine the fate of every survivor in the settlement. Haven's Rest burned in the distance as Elena led the final desperate evacuation convoy through the darkened countryside, the orange glow of the fallen settlement serving as a grim reminder of humanity's diminishing foothold in a world increasingly dominated by the evolved infected. The evacuation had been a masterpiece of coordination under impossible circumstances, with Elena's soldiers creating diversion attacks while civilians escaped through hidden tunnels and forgotten mining roads that the zombies hadn't yet discovered. Dr. Chen's research had proven invaluable in predicting the enemy's movements, But the scientists' warnings about the zombie collective intelligence had become increasingly urgent as their behavior suggested they were approaching a critical evolutionary threshold. The convoy moved in complete radio silence, using hand signals and predetermined routes to avoid detection by the zombie forces that continued to sweep the area in coordinated search patterns. Elena had divided her remaining soldiers into small teams, each responsible for protecting a group of evacuees while maintaining the ability to respond to threats independently. The infected had demonstrated their ability to track large groups, but smaller units moving through difficult terrain might have a chance of reaching the western safe zones before the enemy could coordinate an effective response. Dr. Chin rode in Elena's vehicle, her equipment jury-rigged to function despite the damage sustained during the retreat from the border. The scientist had been working continuously on her theoretical weapon against the zombie hive mind, but the device required specific conditions to function effectively. She explained that the collective intelligence operated on identifiable frequencies that could be disrupted, but doing so would require getting close enough to the central command structure to deploy the jamming signal. The mission would be essentially suicidal, as the zombie leadership was heavily protected by the most evolved and dangerous specimens in their entire force. Elena studied the tactical situation as they traveled, analyzing the intelligence reports from other military units that painted a picture of coordinated failure across the entire region. The zombie invasion had succeeded beyond their worst projections, with multiple settlements falling to the evolved infected in simultaneous attacks that demonstrated unprecedented planning and execution. The enemy wasn't just winning individual battles, they were systematically dismantling the infrastructure of human civilization while expanding their own territory and capabilities with each victory they achieved. The convoy encountered other survivor groups fleeing the advancing zombie forces, and Elena made the difficult decision to combine their resources despite the increased risk of detection. The merged group now included over 200 civilians, ranging from families with young children to elderly residents who required constant medical attention. Dr. Chen's presence had become a source of both hope and controversy among the new arrivals, as word of her connection to Operation Dead End spread through the survivor community like wildfire. As dawn approached, Elena received desperate radio transmissions from the remaining military command posts indicating that the zombie forces were converging on their location with alarming precision. The infected had somehow acquired detailed intelligence about the evacuation routes, possibly through captured communications equipment or interrogated prisoners who had revealed the escape plans under duress. Elena realized that they were walking into another carefully prepared trap, with the zombies herding them toward a predetermined kill zone where the survivors would be completely surrounded and helpless. Dr. Chen confirmed Elena's worst fears, explaining that the zombie collective intelligence had reached a level of sophistication that allowed them to predict human behavior with mathematical precision. The infected weren't just reacting to the survivors' movements, they were anticipating their decisions and positioning forces accordingly. The scientist's device represented the only potential solution, but deploying it would require a volunteer to penetrate the heart of the zombie command structure and activate the jamming signal manually. Elena made the decision that would define her legacy as both a soldier and a human being. She volunteered for the suicide mission, knowing that her military training and leadership experience made her the most qualified candidate for the task. Dr. Chin protested, arguing that the mission required someone with scientific expertise to ensure proper deployment of the device, but Elena's determination was absolute. Her responsibility was to protect the civilians under her command, and if that required sacrificing her own life, then she would face the challenge with the same courage she had shown throughout her military career. The final phase of the evacuation began with Elena's small team creating a diversion attack designed to draw the zombie forces away from the main convoy while she infiltrated their command structure. Dr. Chen provided her with the jamming device and detailed instructions for its deployment, along with the sobering reminder that the weapon's effectiveness was entirely theoretical. Elena embraced each of her surviving soldiers, knowing that she would never see them again, and then disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness on a mission that would determine whether the evacuating civilians would live to see another sunrise. The war between the living and the dead was about to reach its climax, and Elena Vasquez was walking alone into the heart of humanity's greatest nightmare to give her people one final chance at survival in a world that no longer belonged to the human race. Elena moved through the zombie-controlled territory like a ghost, using every skill her military training had provided to avoid detection while approaching the heart of the enemy command structure. The infected had established their headquarters in the ruins of a major city, transforming the skeletal remains of skyscrapers and government buildings into a grotesque fortress that pulsed with unnatural activity. The evolved zombies moved through the streets with purpose and coordination that defied everything humanity had believed about the infected, their behavior resembling a highly organized military operation more than the mindless wandering of traditional horror stories. The jamming device Dr. Chen had provided felt heavy in Elena's pack as she navigated through the urban wasteland, knowing that the success of her mission would determine the fate of every surviving human in the region. The scientist's instructions echoed in her mind as she approached the central command structure, a massive communications array built from salvaged technology and organic components that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. The zombie collective intelligence was more than just shared thought. It was a living network that connected every infected individual across thousands of miles of territory. Elena's infiltration revealed the true horror of what the infection had become during its 3 years of evolution. The zombie leadership consisted of specimens that had undergone transformations far beyond simple reanimation, developing enhanced cognitive abilities and physical modifications that made them barely recognizable as formerly human. These creatures had retained their intelligence while gaining the relentless determination and physical resilience of the infected, creating a hybrid enemy that combined the worst aspects of both human cunning and zombie persistence. The activation of Dr. Chen's device required Elena to reach the central transmission node, a massive organic structure that seemed to breathe with its own rhythm while coordinating the movements of millions of infected across the continent. Elena fought her way through increasingly dense concentrations of zombie guards, using her remaining ammunition and explosives to clear a path toward her objective. The infected seemed to sense the threat she represented, responding with increasing desperation as she approached the heart of their command network. The jamming device activated with a pulse of energy that disrupted the zombie collective intelligence, causing immediate chaos among the infected forces as their coordination network collapsed. Elena watched through the observation windows as zombies throughout the city began to wander aimlessly, their shared consciousness severed and their tactical advantages neutralized. The disruption spread outward like ripples in a pond, affecting zombie forces across hundreds of miles as their ability to communicate and coordinate was systematically destroyed by the expanding interference field. Elena's sacrifice succeeded beyond Dr. Chen's most optimistic projections, but the victory came at a terrible cost that extended far beyond her own life. The destruction of the command structure triggered a cascade failure that eliminated the zombie threat but also revealed the true scope of the devastation they had caused. The infected had been more than just an invading army, they had been the advance guard of a transformation that would have fundamentally altered the nature of life on Earth, and stopping them meant accepting that vast regions would remain uninhabitable for generations to come. The surviving civilians reached the western safe zones as Elena's sacrifice bought them the time they needed to escape the collapsing zombie forces. Dr. Chen's theoretical weapon had proven effective, but the scientist knew that the victory was only temporary. The infection had been contained rather than eliminated, and other evolutionary paths might still be possible if any infected specimens survived in remote areas. The survivors would need to remain vigilant and continue developing countermeasures against future outbreaks that might emerge from the ruins of the dead zone. The new settlement established by the survivors became a monument to human resilience and Elena's ultimate sacrifice, but it also served as a training ground for the next generation of defenders who would inherit the responsibility of protecting humanity's future. The children born in the settlement grew up with stories of Captain Elena Vasquez and her heroic mission, learning that freedom and safety required constant vigilance and the willingness to sacrifice for others when circumstances demanded it. The border between the living and the dead had been redrawn, but the survivors understood that it would always remain fluid and dangerous. The infection had been stopped, but the knowledge that such threats could be created and unleashed meant that humanity would never again enjoy the innocent assumption of safety that had existed before the outbreak. The new world required different skills, different values, and different kinds of courage than the old one, but Elena's example had shown that human determination could triumph even against seemingly impossible odds. Years passed, and the settlement grew into a thriving community that served as both a beacon of hope and a fortress against future threats. The story of Elena Vasquez became legend, inspiring new generations of defenders who understood that the price of survival was eternal vigilance and the willingness to stand against the darkness that constantly threatened to reclaim the world. The war for humanity's future continued, but Elena's sacrifice had proven that even in the darkest times, individual courage could change the course of history and secure a new dawn for those who remained to carry on the fight for civilization and hope.